Hey guys, my name is Matt Core. I'm a concept artist in the video game industry, and when I make concept art, sometimes it just makes more sense to also include 3D as part of my process. Now, if you've already read the workshop, this is going to cover some similar ground because it's the same painting. We're going to make this image, but in this video demonstration, what I really want to focus on is the 3D part of the equation. Because in my opinion, the screenshots in the magazine don't tell the full story about just how cool 3D can be. Now, as a warning, I'm not going to get into every little bit about how I make digital paintings. In fact, I have a website called controlpaint.com where I have hundreds of free videos that sort of break down how to paint in Photoshop. So if you want to know more specific details, I encourage you to check those out. But for today, we are just going to look at the 3D aspect of this illustration. And for the format of the video, I'm going to follow the exact same structure as the workshop in the magazine. So number one is we are going to start with a sketch. It does not matter that I'm going to involve some 3D in this process. It's an illustration first and foremost. So what you see here happens to be done digitally, but I could have just as easily done this with pencil and paper. Now, one thing to notice is I have a layer here that are my guides, and this is just because I knew for this particular illustration it was going to be put on a 2-page spread. So that just means I didn't want to have any sort of interesting stuff right here on this center line because it was going to get caught in the fold. But you can see that there's not a lot of specific details, but it's also not a line drawing. I like to use tone in my thumbnail sketches because it just tells me more about the final image. I don't do color because that would take a little too much time, but I think that this is a nice balance between trying out different ideas and giving me a strong sense of where I'm going without wasting too much time. But it's important to say, no matter what kind of illustration you're doing, 3D or not, a strong compositional thumbnail will help you avoid lots of wasted time. Okay, before moving on to step 2, let's talk about why we're doing this in the first place. Well, with this scene in particular, I have things that are very challenging to draw in perspective. Even if you are excellent at 3-point perspective, certain subject matter is just a challenge. In this case, it's a circular environment, there's arches, a bunch of technical stuff that would be a pain in the neck to draw accurately. So for situations like that, making a 3D model is actually a little quicker and easier, and then I can take a flat image back into Photoshop and then begin to paint over that 2D image. So it's not really a 3D final product, but more of a 3D image as one step towards a 2D illustration, if that makes sense. Okay, so with that in mind, you have to approach modeling in an efficient manner. It would not be faster if I modeled every tiny detail of the environment instead of painting it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of repetition. And with that in mind, I'm going to look at my thumbnail here, and I'm going to decide what elements are good candidates to repeat. So what I decided on here are the figures and these arches in the background. Because of the way that 3D software works, it'll actually be really easy for me to make one arch and one figure and then just duplicate them around the scene. Now, it's fun to model, but we want to be efficient about it, and that means doing a little bit of planning before we start pushing polygons around. So believe it or not, my first step is making design sketches for myself, sort of like concept art. So here I have taken those 2 objects that I'm going to be repeating. On the left here, I've done a little bit more detail about the arch. And then on the right here, I have my figure. So I've drawn him from the back and from the side. And then you'll notice here for my arch, I want it to be symmetrical. So here you can see the left and the right half are the same, which means that if I can just model one half, I can mirror the other half. Once again, we're going to save time. So these sketches I can bring right into the 3D software and sort of use them as a blueprint for my modeling. Now, if you've ever done any 3D modeling, this might actually look a little bit backwards. I want to end up getting to this piece of geometry, but the way I'm going to do it is by starting with a hand-painted texture. So this looks just like that sketch I made in the last section, only I've taken it to much more detail. So here, using a little bit of photographic elements, but mainly hand painting, I end up with essentially one half of the arch. Now you'll notice below the ground line here, there's these blue bricks that go all the way across the canvas. And at the top, I've got the same thing. So these are sort of some bits of trim, and you'll see in a minute why those are so useful. But I'm going to make this texture first, which I then will follow up with the 3D model. As far as the Photoshop document's concerned, there's really nothing all that special about this. You can make a texture in any way you like, because ultimately I'm just going to be mapping this onto a 3D form. So let's see what that looks like. So here I am in 3D software, and this one's actually totally free and open source. It's called Blender 3D. If you've never tried it, I strongly encourage it. But at a very basic level, here's what we're doing. This is an untextured polygon plane, which I can then just apply that painting to. So here on the left, you can see my 2D image, and then on the right here in my actual scene, this is the textured plane. Now, obviously, it's a little flat. So the general process of modeling is sort of adding extra cuts and extra detail, and then shifting things around. And because I made my texture first, I have a lot of information to go on. Now, the really interesting thing about working with 3D is that I can sort of extend here to where I don't have a drawing, but then I can apply part of this image on the left to fill this polygon. So you can see this highlighted orange rectangle corresponds to this one over here. And so as I change what area of my 2D painting is covered up by it, you can see it remaps those little bits of the texture. So this is why I gave myself these trims on the top and the bottom. Because what that means is I can sort of use this top bit to give me a nice tiling stripe, which I can use as a sidewalk. So here I've gotten the alignment a little off, and you'd want to be more careful if you're working on this yourself. But you can see how you take parts of the drawing and then reassign them to your 3D model. Now, granted, there's a lot more to talk about for 3D modeling, and it's out of the scope of this video. But what we end up with is a model that looks like this. Now, once again, I only modeled half. You can see here, this is the half I modeled. And then using a mirror modifier, it just gave me another half. And this right here is the single figure that I modeled. You can see there's a fair bit of detail in the wireframe, but it's really not a very technical model. I didn't give it a face or hands, really anything. I just need a silhouette. And these characters are going to be seen mainly from the back. So this is where I paid most of my attention. So with my pieces ready, it's time to assemble the model. So what you see here on the left is my final goal. This shot matches the composition that I designed in my thumbnail, but what you're seeing is actual 3D models. Now here on the right, I can move the camera around and I can really inspect what I've put together here. Now it is going to look more complicated when you see this than it actually is. So let's take a look at how I put this together. So first off, we had a single half, which then got mirrored with a modifier to be a whole. Well, next I can take that whole and turn it into what's called an array. And the really neat thing here is I can just add instances and make this long row of identical arches. Now we're getting somewhere. The next thing I do is to take that array and bend it around onto itself, creating a circle. And this is really neat because I can literally move some of these modifiers and change the radius. And because all of these modifiers work together, I can still go back and change like the number of door frames. So here we have 5 door frames, or maybe I want 6. Now you can see where the power of 3D modeling comes from. All I modeled was half of one arch, and yet here I have something that's really much more complex. To draw this accurately with a pencil in 3D perspective would be really challenging. So then to get here, all I had to do was take that array and make 2 copies, one for each floor. Then I made a simple floor here, which I duplicated and made it also serve as my ceiling. And then I have my scene. Just duplicate a few copies of the character around, and I can move the camera, and this is very powerful. But the really important approach was to not model every little detail, to do as much reuse as I could, because that's really how I save time. So now that my scene is assembled from my pieces, it's time to add a few lights and to make a render. Now where 3D really starts to look nice is when you apply lighting, because a 3D model seen here in the viewport, well, it's sort of flat. Here I have added a nice little light box and then a bit of rim lighting here in the back, but it's really going to be obvious once I hit the render button why we are doing this. So what do we have here? This looks very nice. It has really realistic lighting with sort of soft shadows, but it's still my drawing. This is a hand-painted texture that I made in Photoshop, but now it has this nice dimensional quality. And this is just one doorway, and it took me maybe 30 seconds to create that render. Now, if that's not immediately obvious why it's so powerful, look at this. This would have been a nightmare to draw, but it was just as easy. It only took maybe 15 minutes to make the render, but setting up the lights was 30 seconds. So here I have the same scene, but with a much taller chamber, but really everything's just duplicated. And here's that same scene again, but with slightly different lighting. So you can see that it gives you so many options to play around with if you've made a 3D scene. It took a little while to create the scene in the first place, but now that I've got it, look what I can create. But for the illustration we're talking about today, this is the image that I ended up with. You can see that the portal is pretty much a placeholder, but the figures and the setting are nice. It gives me lots of detail to work with, and it matches the composition that I designed in my thumbnail. So from this point forward, I'm done with 3D, and everything else we're going to do after this is 2D in Photoshop, the stuff that you're used to. So when I said that was the last thing I was going to do in 3D, I lied a little bit, because this image you're looking at here is another very crucial image that I render out when I work. So what is it? Well, this is just the flat color information of the image. I got rid of all the lighting, and I changed all the colors to be just basic, flat paint bucket fills. But the composition is exactly the same. And where this really shines is my ability to make selections in Photoshop. Because I can take the magic wand tool here, and I can select any of these complicated shapes, and it immediately grabs the perfect outline. So in the next step, you're going to see why this is so effective for the painting process. So from this point forward, I'm going to be working on top of this 3D render and doing painting in Photoshop. But because I made this nice 3D render, I know I'm not going to be shifting stuff around too much. So that means I'm always going to be painting inside of these same shapes. So it's worth my effort to take a little time before I start painting and just make some selections. I'm essentially defining the outer borders of shapes so I can quickly call them up and paint inside of them. Now, one way to do that would be to use the lasso tool or the pen tool and to get in real close and kind of trace them out. But that takes a long time. Because we made that very flat, solid color render, we can do this in a flash. So here I've overlaid my color layer, and I can use the magic wand tool to say, I'll grab this guy as an example. Okay, so I have him as his silhouette selected, and I'm going to hide that visibility. So now I'll make a new layer, and I'm just going to fill it with something really visible. So we'll use yellow here. Now the yellow on its own is not very pretty. This is not the end goal. What's important is that I can hide that layer, but then I can hold down either Control or Command on a Mac and click, and I immediately get that selection right back. This is very powerful. And now any painting I do will stay inside of those boundaries. So what I'll do is just pick the important shapes and set up all of these selection layers before I really even start painting. So what I have here is I have one for people, and that's all of the people. I have one for portal, which is just this circle right here. And then I have sort of two materials. You can see that I've got green bricks and then sort of gray bricks, and then the little blue accents. Well, I might want to be able to paint on just one of those brick types at a time, so I went ahead and created those as selections. But all of it came from this color layer here. See, those are the solid colors that I got from that 3D render. So setting this up was very easy because I had the foresight to generate this flat color image, and then it's just a matter of using the magic wand and making some selection layers. So all that said, when it comes time to paint, I have these up here to just pull quick selections. So again, holding down Control or Command, I can just switch through these various selections and paint inside the lines. This is going to save me a lot of time. So I like to work from very general to very specific. And so for something like this, what that means is I'm going to try and retain all the 3D detail first, And then only at the very end will I zoom in really close and sort of paint manual little brush strokes over everything. So the first step is I just want to change colors and values and sort of start thinking like a painter. And in my opinion, adjustment layers are a really great way to do that. So let's say what I want to do is add a little glow around this sort of circle here, but I don't want it to go on top of the people. Well, the way I would do that would be starting with a selection. So I don't want the portal and I don't want the people. So I'll add those two selections together, and then I'll just get the inverse of those selections, which is in select inverse. Cool. So now that I have the area that I want to change selected, it's as simple as making an adjustment layer. So maybe I'll do levels as a very visible example. What I can do with this is change the sort of contrast of the image by moving these little arrows around. But the really nice thing is I'm not actually destroying anything underneath, because if I toggle the visibility here, I still have the original. So what's really nice about this is that I can click on this black and white mask thumbnail, get out my brush tool, and using black, I can actually hide away the effect. So if I really only want it kind of around here, but not so much around the edges, I can switch to a soft airbrush and then just paint away that effect. So here I'm sort of hiding where that effect is happening and limiting it only to this central region. And if I want to, I can go back and change the effect itself. I can make it even more pronounced and more blown out if that's the look I'm going for. So here I'm using the 3D render as the sort of base information, but then I'm thinking like a painter in making critical creative choices. Do I want something lighter or darker? Do I want to change the colors? And I'll go ahead and do that for the whole image. Now, this is way beyond the scope of this video because I spent hours just sort of crafting it into the colors that I wanted. But this is the basic steps. I'm using adjustment layers instead of actually painting with the brush tool. And to control where the adjustment layers go, I'm calling up selections that I created ahead of time. Now, not everything can be adjustment layers. I have to manually paint at some point. So here you can see the main element that I've been avoiding so far is this portal. Now, I have painted this by hand. And the way I do this is, well, pretty straightforward, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of it on Imagine Effects. You make a new layer, you get out the brush tool, you're going to be using the eyedropper a lot, which is the Alt key, and then you just paint. And maybe you do a bit of erasing, maybe a little free transforming to move the strokes where you want them to go, and lots of sampling. So you're hitting Alt, picking a new color, painting it in, sort of blending between colors, and this is really the bread and butter of digital painting. So I'm not going to go into the details here. But for certain subject matter, it's nice to use tricks, like there's sort of a swirling motion to this circle. One thing that you can do, which is kind of fun, is to select the circle, do Edit, Copy, Merged, and then I'm going to make a new document, paste it inside, because what I want to do is a filter that distorts this into a twirl. Because remember, this is a portal, it's going to have sort of a swirly effect to it. But I happen to know that this filter requires my image to be in the center of the document. If it's not centered, it won't work the exact same way. But here I can have this nice swirl effect. Maybe what I want to do is use the warp command to pull that swirl down to kind of match my image more. But now I can take this back into my image and then just sort of integrate it back in. So I might add a mask, and then painting with the airbrush tool, I'll hide away some of this image. So if I were to hide it all away, you'd see just the underlying layer. But if I were to paint white in the mask thumbnail, I could begin to bring it back. I'm sort of revealing with the mask. So in that case, I wasn't doing just strictly manual painting. I knew that a filter called Twirl would really help me. So sometimes when you're digital painting, it just makes sense to take advantage of some of Photoshop's more niche tools. But frankly, a lot of this was done just with hand painting. And there's really not too many secrets about that. You just paint strokes, erase away what you don't need, and just paint until you've done enough detail. And there's gonna be a lot of details. Depending on your needs, you might find yourself zooming way in and painting with very small brush strokes. Now for me, especially when doing a paint over, I want to hold off and do this as late as possible. Because if there's a possibility I'm going to be changing things, doing detail work like this is really just a waste of time. So with a 3D scene, I am a little bit more confident that the perspective is correct because, well, the 3D software did that part. And then it's just a matter of making sure my composition is working. Are the colors balanced? Does it have a good focal point? Once I can say yes to all of these questions, I've sort of solved my problems. At that point, it is safe to really zoom in small and start painting tiny little details. And so for me, when I make my 3D models, I don't add tons of detail because I know I'm going to do this phase. I know I'm going to get in here and really rough up these edges. And I'm doing that just with sample, which is the eyedropper tool, which is Alt and click. Then I get a new color. And I paint a little in, and then I sample again, and I paint a little more. I'm going to do this for a long time at the end of a painting. So for me, I know I'm going to do that, and I have just consider the 3D modeling process as a bit of a foundation. It's not the final image, but it'll get me started. And then at the very end, I know I don't have to worry about the big questions. I just worry about the tiny little details. So I'm sorry if you were hoping to see me paint every stroke of this process, but really it would have been an unwieldy video. I think for this, I probably spent 5 or 6 hours just doing little detailed brush strokes. You can see I paid special attention here to the orb. This portal has lots of interesting little details happening on the surface, most of which I looked at photos to get inspired by. But there's just lots of stuff. And really, it just takes time. There's no secret to painting details other than practice. But the real takeaway I want you to leave with is how 3D helped me get to this end stage. I know how to draw. I've been doing 3-point perspective for a very long time, well before I learned how to do 3D models in software. And that's key. You have to be able to draw before you can do 3D models. It's not a replacement for drawing in perspective. But sometimes it makes more sense. So for me, I identified the subject matter, which was sort of a technical interior space. I thought, ooh, this is going to be a challenge. 3D right now is going to be an appropriate use of time. So then it was all about how can I do as little time on my 3D as possible to then get into Photoshop and start my paint over. Because I don't want to waste time on needless details in the 3D if really my final result is just a painting. I want to spend time painting. But for me, setting up the scene, getting the right camera angle, and getting an accurate architectural space, well, that was just easier done in 3D software. So the advice I'd give you would be learn 3D software if you want to do backgrounds. You're not always going to use the 3D software, and you shouldn't rely on it as a crutch. But sometimes it really will save the day. And if you already know how to use it when you need to save the day, you're going to be much happier. Now, to learn more details about how I actually do digital painting step by step in free 5-minute videos, make sure to check out my website, controlpaint.com. There are tons of videos there, and I think you'll enjoy them. But in the meantime, try out Blender 3D. It is free and extremely fun. So have fun painting. Thanks for watching the video, guys.